Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're going to have our Great Ideas event, Going Beyond Climate Action and Equity. And my name is Jenny Ludmer. I am the Community Outreach Manager of Sustainable Princeton. So welcome again. We'll go ahead and get started. Molly, could we get the next slide? All right, as we're getting started, we would like to take a moment to thank our longtime partner of the Great Ideas series, the Princeton Public Library. We hope it is not too long before we can return to having these events live and in person at the library when it is safe to do so. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, NRG Energy, whose support allows us to bring you these events. This evening's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website within a few days. When you visit our website, click the Events tab to find the Great Ideas series webpage. You are invited to ask questions throughout the evening. Please do so by clicking on the Q&A button in the toolbar. We will hold all the questions until all three presenters have finished, but then we will run through them and we will try our best to get to your questions. So please, at any time, go ahead and use the Q&A button. When you see other questions in the Q&A, you can also upvote them by clicking the thumbs up icon. Okay, so for those that have attended our recent events, this may look familiar to you. Princeton's Climate Action Plan has some 85 different actions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and also help ourselves be more resilient to climate change. These actions are divided into 5 focus areas or sectors that you can see listed down the middle of the slide. But every action within the Climate Action Plan also meets one or more of our co-benefits, which are listed on the left. If we could go to the next slide. So what are those co-benefits? The first we're going to discuss tonight is promotes equity, fosters economic sustainability, improves local environmental quality, enhances public safety and health, and builds resilience. These are all 5 possible co-benefits within the Climate Action Plan that each of our actions reference. So the 2021 Great Ideas series has focused on these different co-benefits. Tonight, like I said, we're doing a deep dive into the co-benefit of promoting equity, but please mark your calendars for our May 5th event, which will look at the co-benefit of improving local environmental quality. Okay, so what exactly do we mean by having a co-benefit to promote equity? What this is doing is it's ensuring that those most impacted by climate change are prioritized and that costs and benefits of climate mitigation and resiliency are equally distributed. So as an example, let's consider action 6.5 from the natural resources sector of the Climate Action Plan. This action reads to reduce emissions from public and private lawn maintenance equipment. We believe that it is crucial that we do this through the lens of equity. So how would we do that? Let's look at the next slide, please. One opportunity to consider equity in your decision making is called a power analysis. So this considers different populations, different segments of the population rather, on the level of influence that they have in the topic, as well as how impacted they are by it. And once you consider people on these two different spectrums, you get to see some people will fall in this quadrant, which is quadrant 1, that has the least amount of influence, but they're most impacted by it. And so that segment of the population you want to prioritize when you're making your decisions. On the next slide has another way of thinking about equity. We recognize that simply informing the public and even consulting with the public aren't enough. So what we are striving to do with the actions that we help take from the Climate Action Plan is involving the public, collaborating with the public, and ultimately empowering the public. So this is a spectrum that also needs to be considered when you're thinking about moving in an equitable fashion. Okay, so tonight's moderator, and I'm hoping that she was able to join us. We did have some technical issues getting started, but Kim Dorman is the Community Engagement Coordinator for Princeton Public Library. And she has also served on the Princeton Climate Action Plan as our Materials Management Committee member. Christine, I'm seeing you're joining me. Are you going to be standing in for her until we get her up and running?
Yeah, while we wait for Kim, I'll take over the moderator duties.
Okay.
We can get her with us. Hope she'll be able to join us for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you.
So we're very thrilled to have our speakers here tonight. Our first speaker is Crystal Pruitt, who is the Deputy Director of Clean Energy Equity at the New Jersey Board of Utilities. She's there charged with ensuring that New Jersey's clean energy future is accessible to all residents. So we are very thrilled to have her. I'm not going to go through her entire bio, but I will ask Crystal if she can enable her video. And before you get started talking and getting into your presentation, I'll use the question that Kim had planned to sort of tee up everyone's particular session. Was the question, what brings you to this work? What is it that drives you to do what you do?
Thank you, Christine, and hello, everyone. I wish we could be together. Hopefully someday we will be soon and safe. So that is a question that I've gotten quite frequently since starting this position. For me, the cornerstone of this has been the equity part, and that is, doing that work to ensure that people who have been disenfranchised or marginalized or continue to be vulnerable are centered, and we are having conversations and bringing them to the table. So what really resonated for me was being that person, that liaison that was able to be at the table and represent some of these groups and push for change and push for equality and equity, and really, push for a diverse and inclusive agenda. And the clean energy part is just the cherry on the top. Because when we talk about energy, it's not necessarily something that many people think about in social justice terms and accessibility terms. So it was really exciting to be, brought on to take on this role to help start. Well, I'm going to back that up. There have been groups and organizations and people that have been having this conversation. So I'm just excited to lend my voice to this on the state level. So with that, I think I get to start, right? So if you could advance to actually slide number 4, since I can't control my slide. Go back 1. So the division of clean energy is the division that I work under. My office is officially called the Office of Clean Energy Equity, and it is very long in its title, but it's also really important and very unique. I think it might be really the first of its kind on the state level. So in this role, I oversee the development and implementation of clean energy policies, technologies, and programs, including energy efficiency programs, to better serve New Jersey's overburdened communities and to ensure equitable participation in clean energy programs, distribution, and related benefits. I work with my division to make sure that we're implementing and looking at programs through an equity lens, while leveraging many existing programs that aim to serve overburdened communities. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to energy efficiency programming, there is an energy efficiency transition underway as part of Governor Murphy's Clean Energy Act of 2018. So I will be taking part in leading some of the working groups, specifically the equity working group and the workforce development working groups, as we discuss, how to make clean energy, specifically in this case, energy efficiency programming accessible to all customers. And workforce development is how do we expand access to employment opportunities to overburdened communities and local communities so they can take part in the clean energy technology revolution. Because as we look forward, we're looking forward to clean energy. I also collaborate with partner agencies in the implementation of relevant policies, programs, training and education, and will liaison with community-based education. And I also liaise with utilities to ensure they're prioritizing the needs of LMI communities. So when I was asked to participate, I was definitely honored. And there were some topics that needed to be addressed. And one of them is, why did the state create this role and why is it important? So the Office of Clean Energy is an office that was created in 2020, last year. And actually, there were many, many conversations about things like environmental justice and equity. And when the governor signed the Clean Energy Act and made, recommendations related to clean energy, and that developed and was part of the Energy Master Plan, there were many, many components, one of which spoke to LMI communities in making energy efficiency and clean energy access available to all residents, that we are more thoughtful when we have conversations about solar and EV charging and wind energy and energy storage and everything in between. So to get to our goal, we needed to really have conversations and think about how we're going to get there with everyone. And when I speak of the goal, it's 100% clean energy by 2050. So it is a lofty but important goal. So, I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I believe that the board really took up this commitment and really looked at how we address clean energy and give all communities access to it. There was also some legislation that was being considered at the time that I think the legislation is still in the legislature, but it also mentioned an Office of Clean Energy Equity. And it's my belief that the board saw that and was like, this is a great idea. We don't need to wait. We can start working on this now. And that's how we got here. And I believe you've seen since that there's been a lot of conversations about clean energy and clean energy jobs and clean energy access and clean energy equity and just environmental justice and equity across the board. So it's kind of fitting into the theme at hand. So I think, when we have conversations about the greatest points of inequity, that's a really interesting question. So when we're talking about the Board of Public Utilities, we're talking really about ratepayers, and we're talking a little bit more about economics, because that's, when you base things by ratepayers, that's what you're really looking at. So when you understand that, it's really interesting how you approach equity, because you can't adjust rates. Rates are based on usage, right? You use X amount of electricity, you get charged this amount. And it doesn't matter your economic status. It doesn't matter necessarily where you live. So there is a level of big picture inequality, because, not everyone has access to the same energy efficiency appliances. If you live in old housing stock, you may have, a home that isn't really properly weather sealed or weatherized. If you live in a multifamily unit or you don't own a car, what's the conversation you're really going to have about an electric vehicle? When, we have conversations about solar, and if you don't own a home, how do you get access to that? Like, if you can't put panels on your house. So, when we talk about inequality or inequity, we kind of have to look at, well, how are we presenting these clean energy options to people? How are we removing barriers and obstacles to them? So for me, in my experience of being in the office, some of the largest parts of inequality are really those barriers to entry, those things that keep people from participating, not having a thought about, how does someone from this neighborhood get access to that? And not every program is going to necessarily be for every person, but we need to be thinking about that. So in the Office of Clean Energy Equity, there is a lot of, as I mentioned before, overseeing and advising and working with staff to look at our programs. So right now, the biggest program that we're addressing is the energy efficiency program, because energy efficiency can be really the easiest and greatest way to make a difference when we talk about climate change. So if we could move to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks. So I'm talking a lot about energy. And what's really interesting is that I think, we have conversations about climate change and the environment. A lot of people are just like, well, what's the role of the Board of Public Utilities? How do you fit into that? And it's not necessarily as neat and as fun as DEP, but I think what people need to understand and recognize that we deal with, or we are a part of a system about regulating utilities, and we're talking about emissions, and we're talking about energy production, and we're talking about energy storage. So if we can manage and help people use their energy more efficiently, if we are providing pathways to reduce the generation of energy, and then the use of things like peaker plants that come on when there is peak demand and the grid can't generate fast enough. Those types of things, those facilities can create emissions issues, right? And when we talk about emissions, we have to start talking about, greenhouse gases. And we also have to talk about what it means to the communities near them. So if we can look at energy, if we can address energy and be serious about it, we can make a dent, a major dent in the climate crisis. And I know I spoke about peaker plants and I know I spoke about facilities, but we also have to recognize the tremendous role that large and heavy duty vehicles like, transport vehicles and buses play. So we have to look at that too. Like, how do we electrify things? How do we electrify buildings? And how do we change the way we look at things? So we're using less energy. And if we have to use a little bit more energy in some other sector, how are we accommodating for that in a different one? So for me, one thing that I think is really important, and I want to stress when we're having these conversations about climate change, and we're having conversations, is that not everyone's impacted the same way. There are some communities, obviously, that are impacted very, very differently. And these communities are impacted in a way that, they're not necessarily able to rebound as fast. Their infrastructure may not be the strongest. So if we can be really serious about energy usage and how we use it, we can relieve some of that burden on those communities that get really hard hit on these really major weather events that we're having more and more frequently. So if you can go to the next slide. And energy efficiency can indeed change the world for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And if you could go to the next slide, perfect. As I mentioned, there's tremendous benefits to energy efficiency. Improves health conditions. It helps people save money. As I mentioned before, there are hardly any, if at all, considerations based on your income. It's based on usage. So if you're using less, you are spending less on your energy bill. And if you are lower moderate income and you're counting every penny, you're able to save money on your energy bill that can be shifted to something else, or you can save it. And it's also one of the simplest and cheapest ways to make an impact and reduce energy use. And also, we can create jobs. So I want to also just take a little bit of a step back. And I know I was asked to kind of think about what Princeton can do about this. And what's really nice about Princeton is that you do have Sustainable Princeton, and they're very tapped in on the different programmings and where things are going. So this was actually probably the hardest question, trying to figure out, how do I wow this community and this group with something they haven't really heard before. So, I mean, as far as community options, there's things like community solar. There's programs like Comfort Partners that, is specifically made for low-income folks for energy efficiency at no charge to them. There are several programs. So I always encourage people to look at the Board of Public Utilities website or the Clean Energy website and see what's available to them. There's opportunities to audit, government buildings and making sure they're running as efficiently as possible. There's opportunities for schools. There's opportunities for residential folks. There are opportunities to do all those things. But big picture, when we're having conversations like this, I think it's also really important for us to recognize our social role in this. I think so many people forget that there is a social component to this, right? There's always a social component, and it's something that I think that gets lost in the conversation because energy can seem so technical. There is a really big human side to this. And things like power generation and things like electricity and things like regulating utilities and how we think about utilities, we need to also overlay that with social justice questions, like how are we making this accessible? What are our barriers to entry? When we're thinking about this new technology, we also need to think about why we have technology. Technology is created to help people, so we need to understand the people that we need to help. And I think it's really important, and something I believe Christine mentioned in the top of this, we need to bring people to the table. So when you're having conversations about what you can do, you need to understand where your gaps are, what communities aren't being touched. And when you identify them, you need to invite those communities to the table and understand what their needs are. Because a lot of times we have these conversations and they're really, really big conversations about environment and, climate change, and we need to do this and we need to do that, without understanding that there are some communities that do not have the luxury to think of these really lofty ideas. I think I used an example once that if you are trying to pay your bills, if your child has asthma because of the emissions being left off because you live on a trucking route, or you live near a factory or a peaker plant that unleashes emissions in the air, and you're trying to address those needs, someone making an argument to you about we need to worry about the ice shelf and the polar bears doesn't resonate the same way. You need to meet people where they are and understand that people's needs vary. And if we can lift up and bring up the groups that are often kind of not a part of this conversation, we can make the greatest difference, because we need them to be a part of this too. Because if we fail to do that and we're talking really big picture and we're kind of being a little paternalistic and telling communities what they need, we are not serving them. And I would say that when you all are having these conversations, when you have these big ideas, look around and see who's at the table. Who have you left behind? Whose voices aren't there? And make sure you get those voices and you listen and you include them in the planning and you include them in the implementation and you understand where the needs are. So that's usually my big picture spiel when we're talking about what can communities do. The programs are out there, they exist. And, for the Board of Public Utilities, at least for the Office of Clean Energy, I'm looking out about obstacles and barriers on my end. I think in communities, you have to be aware of your obstacles and your barriers, and bring together the people to hear what they are and brainstorm those ideas together. And I think you also have to look internally and into your organization and look at how you address issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity, because that's going to be really, really critically important. So I am actually not sure where I am on time. I feel like I've used up quite a lot. And I don't know if I've missed anything. I mean, you can really get me going on this once I stop being nervous. But I do want to stop here in respect to the panelists that are going to come behind me, unless Christine tells me otherwise.
No, I think this is a good time to switch. But while we ask Mayu and Frida to turn on their videos, I want to ask you, Crystal, could you explain the concept of energy burden? That's something that we in Princeton, included in our climate action plan, was a recognition of what the energy burden is. If you could take a moment to describe that, I think our audience would find that helpful.
Yeah, I am big on trying to come up with real world examples. So if you if you guys will indulge me, I'll try and come up with one that makes sense and illustrates the idea of an energy burden. So say that, household A, who may live, everything being the same, right? same energy efficiency appliances as household B, but household A, lives in a low income census tract, right? And has, obviously it has the income to match that census tract. Now imagine if household B lives in a, moderate to high income census tract. And their bills are, $25, or no, that's not even realistic, about $100. And your low income household, the proportion of what that bill is tremendous compared to your upper middle class. So $100 might be a drop in the bucket for household B, but it might be devastating for household A. And that is if we normalize everything being the same, like appliances and square footage and all that stuff. Now, as I mentioned earlier, LMI communities or lower moderate income communities may not have the same type of housing stock. So you have drafty windows. You may have older appliances that aren't Energy Star. You may have, I don't want to say faulty wiring because then it sounds like a fire issue, but you may not have the same efficiency in terms of your electricity. You may not have energy efficiency light bulbs, right? So then you have a different thing going on, right? Purely because you don't have the same access to, weatherized housing stock, newer appliances. Your energy burden is even bigger because you are, I don't want to say wasting energy, but you are losing energy that you could be saving through efficiency, but you just can't, like someone else can. And then that is also an energy burden because you are now burdened by your electricity bill. Is that a good example, Christine?
Yes, that's exactly it. It's the recognition that, what bills they have to pay on any given month, people who are low, moderate income have a larger portion of their income going towards their energy costs. So that's less money to spend on other things. And so anything we can do as a community to try to reduce that energy burden is what we would perceive as, promoting equity.
Right. And, promoting equity and outreaching to communities that maybe don't know about the programs available to them. Like, for example, Comfort Partners, you can get energy efficiency, an energy efficiency audit and changes to your home. And it's completely free of charge. So making people aware that those are available to them, they can participate in that if they qualify, right? And that can make a huge difference in their bills. And in turn, that can make a huge difference in their quality of life because they're saving money in one area that they can use or save in another.
Yeah. So I believe, Crystal, you have to leave us a little early tonight because in addition to your role at the BPU, you also serve on a council in a neighboring town and you have a council meeting tonight. So if you're, just in case you're not here when we get to the Q&A, there was a question that came in for you. Tammy Sands says, thank you for your presentation. Do you find that LMI, low and moderate income communities, are equally concerned with their environmental impact footprint or about access to affordable energy in general?
Sorry, I muted myself. I was about to say something really epic. No, I think that's actually a really interesting question. And I would actually frame it slightly different. I think there is an awareness of the importance of clean energy, but in every community, and I think specifically in LMI communities. And I think a really good example of that is the environmental justice movement, because that's really grassroots, especially here in New Jersey, being driven by these communities. And it's looking at the quality of life, the quality of air, the quality of water. And that is linking to kind of things that, will happen in the DEP and things that will happen in the board when we have conversations about electric vehicles and admissions and factories and so on and so forth. So I think the community does care, right? I think it'd be disingenuous to think that they don't have a worry, that they don't have concerns. It's just understanding the lens in which they view it. I can't speak, as a monolith for that community, but it's not necessarily, are they worried about their energy footprint, right? I think it's, and I don't know if that's the exact word that their environmental
impact and footprint, yeah.
Their impact and footprint, and maybe the way that someone who has the luxury to kind of contemplate how much plastic they use. I think they're doing it in a very kind of practical way of, I'm not counting the kilowatt hours. I just know that if I have this stuff and I am saving money, that one, that's a benefit. I am saving money. Two, if we're having these conversations and reducing the emissions from buses and trucks and factories, that's helping my quality of life. So I think it's thinking about it in terms of the immediate needs, right? And like, as I said before, when we have these conversations, we also have to check our privilege about what we're really focused on, because not everyone has the luxury to focus on certain things. There are really big picture conversations that are happening that need to happen or are important, but we're not having the same conversations when we talk about lower levels of, or I don't want to say lower levels, like they're lower people, but when we're talking about lower economic communities. It's not about they're worrying about their footprint, they're worrying about their quality of life, and that ties into their amount of energy usage. And once that's addressed, that's a learning opportunity, that's a behavioral change, and you start thinking about energy differently, and it grows from that. I don't know, does that kind of answer?
I think so, yes.
So I do think they care big picture.
Yes. I think that's a good segue here to our next speakers. And Crystal, I hope you can stay with us for as long as you can and be here for some of the Q&A. So we're very thrilled to have Mayu Takeuchi and Frida Ruiz. Mayu is a sophomore at Princeton University studying public and international affairs. And she's been working with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance's Curriculum Committee on local and state level environmental justice education initiatives. And she also serves as the co-chair of the New Jersey Student Climate Advocates under the Princeton Student Climate Initiative and the program manager of the Princeton Environmental Activism Coalition. Frida is a high school senior attending the Sustainable Science programs at Union County Vocational Tech High School and currently serves as one of the co-chairs of the New Jersey Student Climate Advocates under the Princeton Student Climate Initiative. And we're really thrilled to have you both here to co-present and share with our audience sort of the work that you've been doing and the journey that you've been having in incorporating equity and environmental justice into your activism. So over to you both.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you all for being here to engage in this conversation. So like Christine said, I'm Mayu Takeuchi, and I'm really excited to be here with Frida Ruiz as co-chairs of the New Jersey Student Climate Advocates. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So technically, New Jersey Student Climate Advocates, or NJSCA for short, is a part of the Princeton Student Climate Initiative, which is a group at Princeton University working to tackle climate issues from a variety of angles, including entrepreneurial, policy, and other initiatives. For example, there's a climate action plan emission reduction strategies team that actually works directly with Sustainable Princeton and does great work there. But we are here as NJSCA, which is another team within PSCI. And we as NJSCA are a group of about 50 high school, college, and graduate students working across the state on New Jersey state climate policy. So if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So we as NJSCA were founded 3 years ago. First of all, motivated by the urgency and the threat of climate change and wanting to take action as youth who are positioned to experience a lot of the threats of climate change. Additionally, we really wanted to show that youth can and want to be involved in more than organizing, but also making a meaningful impact through policy. And in addition to that, we are here wanting to demonstrate the power of intergenerational collaboration when it comes to creating climate policy moving forward that does center equity. So with that vision in mind, what we were initially founded to work on is a carbon pricing policy to help mitigate climate change. So what we call carbon cashback is our policy that essentially would have put a price on every metric ton of carbon used within New Jersey, and it would also have directed some of that revenue into investments in renewable energy, as well as into vulnerable communities, households, and businesses. So in starting our work there, we began by working on a 94-page white paper, compiling some research about carbon pricing policies and we've presented that paper at various international research conferences. Additionally, we communicated and engaged with over 100 stakeholders from across the state. And with all of that feedback, we gathered the different priorities across stakeholder groups and compiled a draft bill working with State Assemblyman Andrew Zwicker. And so as of last summer, we had a completed bill draft that was on the verge of being introduced into the state legislature. However, at the same time, all through 2020, we were reconnecting with a state environmental justice group, and there we engaged in a lot of discussions that prompted us to realize, importantly, that a lot of our stakeholder engagement had not included environmental justice groups as a key stakeholder base from the beginning and throughout the process of policy development. So we'll expand on this a lot more later, but essentially, we realized that this gap of not including environmental justice groups reflects a lot of the mainstream dynamics in environmentalism, in that a lot of people in the traditional environmental spaces are not representative of the broader public, and especially of people who are most impacted by climate change, as well as the impacts of climate policies. But before we get into that, I'll pass it on to Frida to share a little bit of context about environmental justice.
You can move on to the next slide. So just a quick preface. So most of our members from NJSCA are not from environmental justice communities. So we would just like to state that we're not trying to speak for EJ communities, but rather simply explain our perspectives and lessons that we learned as a student group. So to answer the very important question, what is environmental justice? Simply put, it's the treatment and involvement based on mutual respect and justice of all people, free from any form of discrimination or bias. It's about promoting for underserved communities to get the respect and benefits from all the effects of sustainability and environmental action. According to the 17 principles of environmental justice created during the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, it's crucial to think of environmental justice when writing environmental policy, creating new jobs, allocating funds, and advocating for proper waste disposal and removal of contaminants, and so many more that I could fill in multiple slides for them. But those are just some of the main points that I gathered when I read it. So while I explain a bit about the study and how it has a connection to New Jersey, I really want you to take time and read what's on the slide, because the results are deeply troubling. And this is a study from the Commission of Racial Justice. And even though it was written up in 1987, 34 years later, these communities, including ones from New Jersey, are still dealing with the issues mentioned in the slides. Millions of Americans are living with pollution and exposure to waste every day. And this leads to long-term respiratory problems, potential of cancer, exposure to toxic contaminants has been known to cause a decrease in IQ of children. So this is something that so many people, including from New Jersey, have to deal with in their day-to-day life. And which brings us to the point of environmental justice is important because EJ communities have been stripped of their basic rights to clean air, water, healthy food options, and more for way too long. And if we don't bring awareness about it, it's something that's just going to keep on going. So with this knowledge in mind, we had second thoughts regarding the policy, and Mayu can expand on that.
Yeah, for sure. And so, as I mentioned before, all throughout last year, we connected with a state environmental justice group. And before I get any further, I just want to take this space to just really say how much we appreciate having had those conversations, appreciate their time and effort. in engaging us with a lot of intense discussions that we had that prompted us to challenge our assumptions and really tackle the questions that Crystal raised earlier about who is at the table, and more importantly, who's not at the table where these climate policies are being discussed. So in having these conversations, the environmental justice folks shared with us a lot of historical context and a lot of phenomena in the daily world, like Frida just shared. And we also learned about ongoing political dynamics, including issues that revolve around tensions between environmental and environmental justice groups that I think some of the questions earlier were getting at. So with that in mind, we've kind of come up with several takeaways that are currently now our guiding principles. So if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are our three main guiding principles that we've learned from those intense discussions with the State Environmental Justice Group. The first one is the importance of understanding the context dependency of all of these discussions. So as Crystal was getting at earlier, everyone does care about the environment. People care about the environment and climate issues, but that just manifests in different ways. But it's important to realize that it manifests in different ways because of our different contexts, our different backgrounds and perspectives. So for example, getting at the tensions between environmental and environmental justice groups, one thing that we learned as a group is that, for example, when talking about carbon pricing policies, a lot of environmental groups, I don't want to generalize, but in general, environmental groups can think a lot about statewide or nationwide targets when it comes to decreasing emissions to mitigate climate change. Whereas on the other hand, environmental justice groups are there really tuned in to when some local disparities may be exacerbated because of climate policies, even if they achieve overall emissions reductions. And so this has happened in several instances of climate policies being implemented around the country and in others. Additionally, we do recognize that when it comes to thinking about environmental justice, again, each community does have their different needs as well as strengths, and it's important to recognize that as we think about engaging with environmental justice communities. Frida?
And a lot of what Mayu touched upon before kind of goes perfectly into the next point, striving to be inclusive. For instance, when writing policy, or advocating for reductions in CO2 emissions, or cleaning of toxic waste landfills, it's very important to consider EJ communities and not forget about them. Like Mayu had mentioned before, many times, many people have goals to make America or even New Jersey more sustainable, again, focusing more on the bigger picture, but they don't realize that EJ communities end up becoming sacrifice zones and their conditions get worse and worse. So it's definitely important to bring them into the table and bring them into the discussions like everyone has been mentioning.
Yep, and that leads perfectly into the last bullet point about emphasizing building just relationships. So I think this is a big theme that always comes up in our discussions at NJSCA, but building these just relationships can take many forms. The first may be to work with environmental justice groups and communities from the very beginning. So rather than just approaching them to get feedback on a bill that's already been created or on a program that's already been drafted, it's important to engage them in conversation and have them at the table from the very beginning. Second, this may involve recognizing that even though people may have the best intentions when it comes to wanting to support environmental justice communities or environmental justice groups, that also involves the community inviting you in, making space for you at their tables to discuss and move forward as in part of a partnership. So it's important to be cognizant of that relationship as well as any other underlying power dynamics there may be that affect the dynamics of that interaction. And lastly, engaging and centering equity and environmental justice may and probably should involve exchanging or giving up some sort of power, in that a lot of times when we think about environmental justice, there are so many environmental justice groups out there that have been doing this work and fighting this fight for environmental justice for decades and decades. So they are the ones that know a lot and have this experience. And so oftentimes the best thing to do can be to step back and take the lead of the environmental justice groups. Frida?
Yeah, and just to perfectly tie everything off, based on all those reflections that we made, we definitely tried to implement the guiding principles into our current work, which include social media projects, which include just highlighting a lot of environmental justice news and environmental justice leaders, community partnership building, which includes us trying to build those just relationships with several different EJ organizations, and policy research and engagement, which is not only analyzing and looking at certain policies that help EJ communities, but also with the whole engagement, really being able to tell our story, especially as a youth perspective, because not only will that hopefully inspire some other youth to really take a stance and really become leaders as well without making those mistakes that previous groups have made.
Yep, and that is it from us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Frida and Mayu. Crystal wants to pop back on and bring up something that she forgot before she has to leave us. So Crystal, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, first, I want to just thank Mayu and Frida for all their hard work and just their great presentation. And I totally forgot that you guys were the same students I used to work with in my old life when I was chief of staff for Symington Wicker. So it all comes full circle. But something that I think is really important, big picture, especially when we talk about communities and we talk about local and state and even federal governments. And I think the students touched on it briefly. When we're having these conversations about low and moderate income communities and where they're placed, and when we have conversations about environmental justice communities and the issues that they're facing, I think it's really important for people to understand that those aren't accidents. People aren't living in those places purely by accident. It is by design. It is by things like housing policies and redlining and zoning that people are placed in these situations. So I think it's really, really important. And I think that's something that maybe isn't talked about the same way as we talk about other things. These aren't accidents. These are intentional things done by people in power and governments, and I'm a member of government too, right? So we have a responsibility to start undoing them, and that is intentional work, and that is thoughtful work. And that includes making sure that we're talking to stakeholders, like the students mentioned, because I think they learned a really important lesson, and it's gonna make for better policy and a better plan. That when we have these conversations, when we're thinking about things, we can't think about these things as coincidence and happenstance. We need to recognize the hard truth that these things have been in the works, and these things are part of a larger institution that has led to this. So as being members of individual institutions, we have a responsibility to begin to undo the harm to communities. So I think that's my one last takeaway before I run off and be an institution and a council myself. But thank you all so much. This was an absolute pleasure. And thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you very much. Okay, Jean Durbin and Linda Oppenheim, if I can ask you to please enable your videos. And I forgot to ask Mayu and Frida what brought them to their work, but we'll ask them that question when we get to the Q&A. As I introduce Linda and Jean, Linda Oppenheim is a member of Not in Our Town, Princeton. And Jean Durbin was a former member of the Civil Rights Commission. And they were both involved with the development of the Princeton Civil Rights Commission's Racial Equity Impact Assessment Toolkit. So we're very excited to have them here to talk about that toolkit, how it was developed and how it's intended to be used. Sustainable Princeton has been using that in some of its current work. We're very excited when it came out because we were looking for tools to help us to begin doing a better job of practicing equity in our work. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Linda and Jean.
Thank you so much, Christine and Jenny, and to everyone in Sustainable Princeton. We who worked on the toolkit were very excited that you took it up immediately, and we look forward to hearing how well it works for you. In racial justice impact statements, you might hear something that sounds familiar because they are somewhat modeled on environmental impact statements. It's a systematic examination of policies, programs, all the work, for example, that a municipality like Princeton would be doing, and a way of seeing where bias can creep in and how that would impact on various groups. In particular, we're interested in the impact on racial groups. We heard about it. Actually, I want to give a nod to Professor Linda Dodd at the University School for Public and International Affairs, who first mentioned them at a Board of Education Equity Committee meeting. And subsequent conversations with Mr. Tom Parker, who's chair of the Civil Rights Commission, led to an agreement that this would be something useful for the town to take up. That was in January, February 2020, and we were facing what we imagined would be months of slogging through, of trying to convince people about the importance of it. And then May 25th happened, and George Floyd was murdered. And around the country, around the world, people who hadn't been, were awakened. And one thing that the mayor and the council did was to propose a resolution. It was passed. It's when we show you, I'll show you which number it is. It was a resolution to declare racism a public health crisis. Those of us not in our town, immediately when we knew this was coming up to the council meeting, we wrote to the mayor and this was Mayor Liz Lempert, and to the council members, applauding them and bringing this resolution and supporting it, and also mentioning the racial equity impact statements as a tool that could be used to re-examine township ordinances, budgets, programs, policies, which they wanted to do. The task was given to the Civil Rights Commission, and Jean and I were part of a task force that was led by Afshin Shamsi and Surinder Sharma, who is a Civil Rights Commission commissioner. Jean was also at the time. We worked on it for a few months, and we came up with the following. Jean, I could also go to the actual site if you want, rather than look at it as a slide. Would you like me to do that?
Okay. Look, we have some of the, pulled out some of the questions from the toolkit. Is that?
That's fine.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah. Jean, do you want to go through some of them? And
Sure. I actually, could I just make a few comments before we go through the questions, Linda? I just, when I think about the toolkit and what it is, it's a series of 17 simple questions. It's really about communication and engagement, and openness and a willingness to engage with groups that might be different from your own. One-to-one communication, town halls, focus groups, surveys. Really, you want to try to put yourself in the shoes of the other or another. It's also about kind of project planning and management for looking at policies and programs and budgets with a real focus on equity. So the series of questions that were designed should be asked. You should run through the questions with various groups in mind and with various budgets, policies, programs in mind. It's very much context dependent, like Mayu and Frida mentioned. And to echo what Crystal mentioned, it's very intentional work. So it was a pleasure working on this with the ad hoc committee of the Civil Rights Commission. Some of the questions don't apply in every situation, but they're very basic questions to get you to think. Why is the program or policy needed? What gap does it fill? What resources are needed to execute the program or policy? Who's developing it? These are sort of the timeline project management pieces. Who will execute it? What's the intent of the program and how will it be communicated? And how will training be provided to staff to ensure that effective implementation of the program policies racial equity impact is employed? Essentially, there are more, and each question, I think I've said this before, it doesn't apply in every scenario. It's meant to be sort of a living document, and it can change and grow and be augmented depending on what you're addressing. This was a good start, and the Civil Rights Commission recommended that it be used for the municipality. I think we recommended traffic engineering as a pilot department after we ran through it ourselves, looking at a fiscal budget policy. So it was a fun exercise. Lisa, Linda, do you want to take the next few questions?
Okay. Notice that there's concern about what the consequences could be, and for people to give thought into if they sense that there could be a burden, what alternatives solutions could be found. And the questions 12 and 13 highlight the stakeholders. I really think that Maya and Frida and Crystal brought up the essential point of whose voices are being heard, who is at the table. And those questions were aimed at capturing those voices, not allowing them to be ignored or overlooked. Also, that vague statements aren't useful. We need benchmarks, and that's where statement 15 comes in. We have to be able to measure progress. And then, as Jean mentioned before, communication is extremely important, and we want the public to know as well as the people who would be most affected. So we see this, it's a tool, and it's a tool created by people, and as such we know that it's not going to be perfect. It's going to reflect our own biases, even though it's intended to help people be aware of the biases that might creep into their work. So as Jean said, it's a living document, and we expect that as it is used, and we hope that it will begin to be used soon. We're in a situation in the town where Mark DeShields, who's been the town administrator and was a supporter of this, is coming to the end of his term, and we're going to be moving into an interim period. So we're not quite sure of how quickly we'll be able to get this to the department heads to begin to learn about it. In the process of developing the toolkit, some of us were able to hear what programs were being created in other places in the States. It has been in effect in various places, in Kings County, Washington State, in Seattle, in St. Paul. We heard from someone from Boulder and someone from Albemarle County, which is where Charlottesville is located. And they've done some very interesting work in terms of using maps with layers to show, for example, if you're talking about park improvement or where you're going to be planting trees, you can overlay that to income levels in various parts of town so that you can make sure that there is the equity is included in those kinds of decision making. That's pretty much where we are at the moment, waiting to see it used. And again, our gratitude to Sustainable Princeton for picking it up immediately as a possibility.
Thank you, Jean and Linda. I think we'll move on to our Q&A now. But first, I think we want to do a quick poll. Jenny Ludmer, my colleague, if you're ready.
Absolutely.
We want to engage our audience in a little exercise here. And panelists, you can participate as well.
Absolutely. I just put a link in the chat. Hopefully everybody can see it. It's a short link. And what you'll do is go to that website. And I can put it in there again. And you'll see a question. And when you pull it up, and that question is, what can I do personally to promote equity? So we want everybody to think about themselves. You've heard a lot about equity tonight. So what can you be doing to promote equity? And you are able to enter one word in each of those slots. So just take a moment and think about it and enter one word or two or three and hit submit. And in a moment, we will show a word salad of what everybody is thinking about so you can get other ideas as well. Okay, here's what we're getting. It's still building as you are entering your answers. And I love it. I think this is great. So we see definitely a lot of people are recognizing the need to listen, to question, to understand, to advocate, to think. I see a couple of different considerations just to educate yourself, to be thoughtful, to engage, to empathize, also to research, to be reading, understanding, and considering your own biases. This is great. Thank you everyone for participating. Christine, I'm happy to hand it back to you and we can move on with the Q&A.
Great. Okay, so I think we have Kim Dorman, who's been able to join us. Kim, if you'd like to, there we are. Thank you so much, Kim. We didn't get a chance, and we'd like to start by asking the question that Kim so wisely brought up as a way to sort of introduce folks to Mayu, Frida, Jean, and Linda as to what brings you to the work that you're doing.
I think we should let Mayu and Frida take that one.
Okay, I'm happy to start it off, but I would also love to hear from you both as well. So as for me, I actually am very new to working on climate environmental issues. I would say I started in just the summer before my freshman year, so this was almost 2 years ago at this point. But before then, I was always interested in issues like education equity and the availability of opportunity for people to really to reach and fulfill their potential. But then starting the summer before my freshman year, I got involved with NJSCA working on climate policy. But what really now motivates and drives my work with environmental justice is the fact that I've had the opportunity to engage with a lot of people from environmental justice communities, speaking about their experiences, both positive and negative. Positive in that they were successful in kind of pushing forward their concerns about environmental justice and also working to fight climate change, but also the obstacles that they faced. And for example, being at town halls, sharing their concerns where they felt silenced and unheard. So kind of hearing both sides of that narrative definitely continues to drive my work to center environmental justice. Frida?
Yeah, and I don't know, as someone who I guess I've always been passionate about the environment ever since I was little, I tried exploring different avenues of it, and one of them included policy work. I was initially driven to join NJSCA because I had noticed that this was actually an opportunity where youth can have a voice. And that was something that I didn't really see often. And especially when looking at different clubs and extracurriculars at my school, there weren't really that many like environmentally focused ones. So I was really happy and motivated to join NJSCA. And then like Mayu mentioned, over time, what really drives me to work and focus on environmental justice is what Mayu said, but also remembering kind of my roots of coming from Peru, coming from an area that has a lot of these issues that they have in America, and really just thinking about all my relatives, and that tends to drive me forward.
I don't work exclusively in the environmental justice space. I'm more of a policy person. I social work degree and a law degree, and I really want to use those skills to make the world a better place. And I'm so inspired by your generation, Mayu and Frida, and I'm inspired by Sustainable Princeton. And we have a lot of great questions to answer. I'm going to turn it over to Linda.
I haven't worked in environment. I think environmental justice is critical. It really displays where disparities are in our society at all levels. I've been involved in Not in Our Town, Princeton since 2005, and that's a local racial justice organization. And we do a variety of things in terms of advocacy and education. And one of the things that we promote is that to make changes, substantive changes in terms of racial justice, you have to be working on 3 levels. There's the inner work, looking at our own biases, educating ourselves, even on things like the history or about issues like environmental justice. There's the interpersonal, what kinds of relationships we are establishing with people who aren't like us, but also with the people that we're closest with. Are we standing up for racial justice in the face of racist remarks or other actions? And then the third level is the systemic. And not being someone like Crystal, who is directly involved in creating policy, we can do advocacy, but we're always looking for something to use to address systemic racism. And that's why the racial equity impact statement really jumped out as something substantive, something concrete, something that we could hand to people who do policy work and say, this is another tool that you can use to work towards racial justice.
Thank you so much. What I love about this whole conversation and panel is you can see how the work that each of you are doing together helps to make the world a better place, even though it seems sort of maybe possibly disparate to you at the beginning. We have a question from Callie Hancock. And she says that, she was correcting it. And so her question, so I wanted to, it's gone. It's disappeared. Never mind Callie's question. Tammy Sands says it's wonderful to have the youth engaged in environmental justice and that the group is relooking at the manner the bill was drafted. And the question is about how have you considered the Indigenous communities, because often there has been erasure around Indigenous communities. They're still here. We have 3 tribal nations in New Jersey. And so if you could speak to that, please.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for bringing that up too, because they do often get erased from these conversations. But as NJSCA and also me being part of several other organizations at Princeton, we especially engage with the people of the Lenni Lenape tribe who like Princeton University is located on their land. And so through a variety of programming, especially in like the coming months, but also in the past year, we have been engaging with them. As with NJSCA specifically, we're still navigating this process of establishing trust like relationships built on trust with these different communities. And so as of now, we are consciously and actively trying not to reach out to everyone all at once, because we recognize that this process of engaging with communities does take time and requires building meaningful relationships. So eventually our hope is to continue expanding these efforts to meaningfully engage with the Lenni Lenape tribe as well as others. But yes, we are working towards that for sure.
Thanks. Frida, was there anything you'd like to add, or anyone else? No. Okay.
No, that was perfectly said.
Terrific. Me too. Nicholas Choquette-Levy says, thanks, Mayu and Frida, for all your work and an important talk. Curious if you could say more on how you and other NJSDA members reconciled your desire for urgent climate action with the time it takes to develop just, equitable, and long-lasting relationships with EJ groups.
Yeah, okay, I can start this one off and pass it to Frida after. So yeah, thanks, Nick. It's a great question. I would say it, first of all, was a very intense series of discussions that we had both within the group as well as with others outside of it. I will say that during the entire time, there were a lot of members on both sides. Like I would say the group was fairly split for a while on this decision of whether or not we should continue pushing for carbon cashback or stall the policy. But I think a key question that we all grappled with was like, yes, continue with carbon cashback may surely help fight climate change, and it may be a quicker solution than taking this time to build up the relationships. But then the question becomes, what are we fighting climate change for? If we're continuing to build on this world and like fight climate change, but in a way that continues to exacerbate or reinforce these inequalities that are in place, yeah, like what future are we working towards, and why would that be meaningful if we don't fight the existing systemic inequities? Frida?
Yeah, and something to add is that these are people who are living their life day to day and rely on their quality of life. And if we all as people advocate for the equality of everyone, we should take the time to really maintain and build these long-lasting relationships, because that's human to human, that's human decency. A lot of what sustainability and environment is all about is advocating for all human rights, for all humans, who we all share the same resources and live on the same planet, for all of us to have clean air, clean water, etc. So it's very crucial to really take the time. However, outside of environmental justice, there are a lot of other problems within the environment that all of us as individuals have passion about, and we obviously take the time to focus on other problems. Like for instance, another passion I have is implementing environmental education. So I've been working on an organization that I have called the Green Cause. So all of us as a generation can work with multiple different passions and multiple different activities.
Thank you so much. I think that something that as we're talking and as just thinking about this unique panel, I'd like to know, often I think that when we present things in panels, it seems like, oh, these are the answers and we have all the answers. And it's hard for people to reflect like what, that we're all learning in public and we're trying to figure it out. And so I'd like to know, in your work, what have you learned that kind of like, what was something that sort of changed the way that you thought about this, that helped you to sort of see things more deeply or understand things in a different way so that you could find a more equitable path, I guess. Does that make sense? Like something that for you sort of said, changed the way that you thought and helped you to be more intersectional. Jean, thanks.
Sure. For me, it's been a journey. I mean, I grew up in a white rural part of Pennsylvania, moved to Princeton, New Jersey after I had children. And my work here in this community and being exposed to the diversity in the community, learning and growing, joining the Civil Rights Commission, working with you, Kim and Linda, and so many others, You know, it's been a real eye-opening, wonderful journey in Princeton, and never stop learning. And it's what sort of keeps me going, particularly during the pandemic. So none of these issues were talked about in the space where I grew up. So it makes me feel proud to be part of the community, and it makes me want to keep learning more and keep working to, as I said before, make the world a better place. Together we can do it, and I'm inspired. So I feel like I may never leave this town because I'm happy that I landed here with the diversity that is here.
Linda? Thanks.
There are a couple of things. Not in our town itself, we have an evolving mission statement. And it's one that is more and more focusing on white supremacy as a system, and kind of the racial hierarchy that gives people who are more proximate to whiteness, people who are white, people who are more proximate to whiteness, have more power and privilege. And it really is an issue of power and who has access to that. That was really very important to change my understanding. In some training we do, it's that equity isn't going to be harmonious relationships. It's going to be an equal distribution of power. And that's, people in power don't give it up, if at all, easily. And I have to be thinking about what I say, what I do all the time. And I'm so grateful when people will point things out to me. When we were doing the prep for this program, and I said something, and Mayu and Crystal really had to remind me who needs to be centered here. It's Black, Indigenous, people of color who really need to be centered in racial justice work. So I was very grateful that they pointed it out to me. It's learning every day.
Yeah, and adding on to that, it's absolutely just constantly a learning process. And I think that was very eye-opening to me because so as of last year, when NGSCA had been working on the carbon cashback policy and had been working until then, we were mostly engaging with folks from labor, business, and environmental groups that are often the traditional environmental stakeholders that you typically think of when it comes to creating climate policy. But then when we engaged for the first time with, or when we reconnected with the state environmental justice group, they raised all of these issues about the power imbalances, issues, even thinking about the existence of disparities when it comes to not only the impacts of climate change, but also the impacts of climate policies themselves. But none of those issues were really raised by the traditional stakeholders that we had been engaging with. So to realize that there were decades and decades of context, decades of these environmental justice groups being marginalized and being silenced by the dominant environmental groups, realizing that was shocking, and it definitely makes me see this whole conversation about climate policy in a different way.
Thank you so much for sharing those responses. I was asking people to be vulnerable, but I really appreciate that you shared your experiences, because I think too often I think it's a critical part of how we can get to a better place. These are hard conversations. It can be sort of hopeless a lot of the time talking about sustainability and environmental justice and issues around racial justice. So I want to sort of close on a hopeful note, a positive note. If there's something in your life, in your work, or that's happening around sustainability or racial and environmental justice at the moment that's giving you hope, that you're excited about, something that you think like, okay, that's a positive step. We're starting to get this. Is there anything that comes to mind for any of you? I'm thinking, for instance, of the policy that has just passed to stop to make companies more responsible about further pollution in overburdened communities. I don't know if Crystal had a chance to speak about that.
She did not, but I think you're referring to the cumulative impacts policy that was recently passed last fall. And I guess to give a little bit more context behind that, that policy, that bill had been repeatedly introduced into the legislature for years and years before it finally passed last fall. But especially with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement last summer and so much just dialogue happening about racial injustice and the systemic issues, that finally, like, I guess, tipped the scales in terms of getting that policy passed. And it's really encouraging to see that there is continued dialogue about how to make sure that those policies are now enforced properly and enforced with the involvement of the communities themselves. Yeah, and just being with NJSCA and having so many members, young members here who are really taking the meaningful and thoughtful approaches to thinking about climate policy, that definitely gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, and just to add a bit on that too, I guess a little bit of my answer to the previous question and this question. So certainly the whole Black Lives Matter movement really, again, really made me shocked for when hearing a lot of their experiences, especially their day-to-day experiences. I've heard a lot of different videos and stories of things that I never had seen, especially since I had moved from Peru to a predominantly white town, and although of a person of color, I have experienced some I felt like alienated in some way, but I've never seen it to be that bad to that extent, and that was very shocking. So that definitely was a big eye opener to me, and that really drove me forward to wanting to really bring awareness about environmental justice. But yeah, I completely agree with the points that Mayu made.
In terms of education, Kim, just to round it out, I also have hope in that, education within our schools is changing in terms of talking about these issues and addressing racial inequities and the real history of America and institutionalized racism and environmental justice. So I feel like there's hope there. These are topics, again, that were never discussed in my generation. So grateful for that.
I will just add quickly that I'm hopeful from what I'm hearing from different generations. I've had much older people who are coming to me and saying, I had no idea. They're just reading now. They're just opening themselves to, so it's never too late. And at the same time, we have new youth advisors where we would have 1 or 2. We now have 10 from Princeton High School who have joined in the work. So having that energy coming from all generations is really very heartening.
Thank you so much. I have a question that's something that we're thinking about, generally speaking, is, how would you recommend, but this is something that I'd like us to sort of all think about as we're going forward. How would you recommend identifying the environmental climate justice issues in Princeton? You've heard all of the panelists speak about, issues generally, but what do our panelists and what do the people who are here in the audience think of as potentially issues here in Princeton? So hopefully we can gather that information the next time we're all together. But thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to Mayu, Frida, Jean, Linda, Jenny, Christine, Molly, everyone who filled in this evening. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Thank you to our panelists. And as a reminder, this recording will be on our website if you missed any part of it, and available on our YouTube channel. So thank you for everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. Good night.
Good night.